AviationPros.com is the portal website for AMT, Airport Business, and Ground Support Worldwide magazines. Visit daily for breaking news, industry blogs, and insightful articles from our magazine's editorial team. And don't forget to sign up for our publication's daily e-newsletters. It's all at AviationPros.com.
Hello and welcome to the Aviation Pros podcast. I'm Josh Smith, editor of Ground Support Worldwide, and today we're speaking with Doug Backinger, Senior Vice President of Solutions, Engineering, and Innovation at Aerol, and Alex Harden, the company's Technical Product Manager, to learn more about the details that go into the design of ground support equipment. Doug, Alex, thank you very much for your time and your willingness to share more information about this subject.
Thanks, Josh. We appreciate you having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course, we're glad to have you. And Alex, really the main question we want to answer for our listeners today is, what should someone consider when they're spec'ing components such as running gear or casters when designing a GSE unit? And so I guess before we dig into a few of the specifics, can we start with some broad examples of factors that must be considered when working with a manufacturer to design a GSE for a specific application?
Yeah, and there's a lot of them. So, things you want to consider are load capacity. You want to consider your speed of your application. You want to look at your duty cycle, so how much you're using the equipment versus it just sitting in place. Also, whether the equipment is indoor or outdoor use and what type of mixture between that you might have. Again, going back to the duty cycle, you want to consider looking at different environments, whether you're hot, cold, maybe wet, maybe in a sunny environment. Also, things you might want to look at are externally, which would be what type of terrain you're going over. Is it indoor use, meaning it's being used on a very flat, polished surface versus being outside on a tarmac with obstructions, or maybe even an unimproved surface. If you're looking at military applications, potholes and gravel roads, those are kind of some of the main things you want to look at before considering either casters or running gear.
Could I add one people usually overlook would be chemical exposure? So, for example, like hydraulic fluid and other types of fluids that are found around aircrafts. That can have a big impact on the types of materials that you want to use.
Great. Well, let's expand on a couple of those examples. And, one you pointed out, obviously ground handling takes place in a variety of environments, and a GSE, needs to be able to stand up to all types of weather. So can you elaborate, Alex, a little bit on how climate factors into those design decisions?
Yeah. So you want to really consider, obviously there's all different types of weather and in multiple different applications. So you've got wet applications. You may want to consider certain types of polyurethane in those instances. Or if you have a very high heat application, say it's outside on a tarmac in an arid climate, your tarmacs can reach upwards of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which may be influential in a bad sense to polyurethanes, right? They can begin to debond at that point. So you may want to choose a mold-on rubber or a pneumatic wheel and tire set instead. Also, UV exposure can degrade polyurethanes, as well as any sort of coatings, paints, and things over time. Also, low temperatures, things can become brittle and break. Depending on your temperature, you may want to specify polyurethane over rubber wheels and vice versa. Other things to consider would be, is it a wet environment? So is it raining? Other things, people don't consider are, shipboard applications. Sometimes ground support equipment isn't necessarily on the ground, right? It's at sea. It can be on board aircraft carriers and other naval ships or commercial vehicles, even offshore oil rigs. And so then you want to consider salt exposure as well.
And of course, Aerol is well versed when it comes to moving GSE from one location to another. And Alex, when should you consider shock absorbing or shock mitigating products? And how does the speed and distance that GSE travels maybe play into that decision?
So there's two different kind of applications here. You've got Department of Defense or military applications, and then you also have commercial applications, commercial aviation or rocket manufacturing, things of that nature. So you want to consider over the path of the tool. You may want to look at are there obstructions? A lot of even tarmacs that are prepared may have up to 2-inch obstructions in between the concrete pads and whatnot. So that can increase your loads greatly compared to what your tool load rating might be potentially. Also, looking at Department of Defense and military applications, a lot of things need to be specified for unimproved surfaces. So that would be gravel roads. Oftentimes these gravel roads have potholes or uneven surfaces. They're putting in airfields in locations where they normally aren't. So shock mitigation can play into the fact that you're protecting not only the tool, you're also protecting the payload, right? And oftentimes these payloads are also either sensitive or extremely expensive. So those are really two important factors to think about. And then again, going back to duty cycle, like what speed are you traveling at during these applications? Oftentimes these applications can be specified up to 25 miles per hour. And so what you have is a tendency for heat to build up within the wheels, within the system. So oftentimes polyurethane can get a lot of heat generation, can cause debonding issues, especially if it's in these arid climates where it's already has a high ambient temperature. Probably not good to specify those. So you may want to consider mold-on rubber or pneumatic tire and wheel sets in those applications. Yeah, so long distance can, again, just create more heat as well as keep it there in the system. So you may want to consider also duty cycle at that point, resting periods.
Yeah, and the other place, which isn't as obvious when you want to consider shock absorption. So most of the time they're thinking about how do I protect my structure or my payload, but really there are a lot of applications that have ground pressure requirements. So say you're running on asphalt and you have something really heavy and you need to make sure that your stress on the ground stays below a certain number. You can also use shock absorption there to help level out that load and ensure that you're not point loading at any point in time, no pun intended.
So Alex, what type of maintenance is required to keep GSE parts and components like casters in good working condition out in the field?
Yeah, so maintenance is pretty critical. Although, a lot of manufacturers tend to make equipment, greased for life or sealed for life, especially with outdoor application. That's pretty important that your systems are sealed. However, especially when receiving a new tool that's been set up and specified, it's important that maintenance teams look at these systems probably more frequently in the beginning, monthly, remove the cart from the ground, check the spool sections, check that your wheel bearings are still functioning correctly, grease them at that point, especially if you see any grease on the components themselves, then you may want to check your seals at that point as well. Now, throughout the life, you may want to decrease that interval, especially depending on duty cycle. If you're at like 100% duty cycle, meaning it's being used constantly, you want to increase those frequencies of maintenance, greasing, checking bearings, swivel sections, tires for wear. You want to check braking systems for wear. And whether those components need to be adjusted over time. But if you're in the 25% duty cycle range or lower, you could probably go 3 to 6 months between intervals and checking, or even a year, especially if it's an indoor application.
And is just a quick follow-up to that, are these maintenance cycles, would those be kind of established by the manufacturer? Is that who you'd consult to follow best practices?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the application, really. But so I don't know that we necessarily have a recommendation for every application. We have broad standards. Again, 1 month, 3, 6, and 1 year intervals would be kind of a standard application. And depending on what you see in the field, may determine your maintenance interval after that point.
Yeah, and I would say too, as a manufacturer, I think our maintenance requirements tend to lie on the conservative side. And, like Alex mentioned, even doing a yearly inspection, I think would put a company probably on the leading edge of the maintenance curve from what we've seen in our experience.
Are there any outlier applications that pose, specific challenges to GSE design, and how can businesses like Aerol help customers overcome some of these unique situations?
Yeah, so Alex, if you don't mind, I'll take that one. Kind of along with just the general requirements of being able to, pull a cart or trailer at high speeds, usually we'll run into situations where there'll be certain tools or stands that, while they're towed primarily, still require some human intervention to get it into its final position. So I would say working with a company like Aerol, where we manufacture everything here in Albion, Michigan, we're really big on customizing and designing custom solutions. So we've helped out stand manufacturers or airlines that are using maintenance stands that get towed across the tarmac, and in their final position, they still need an employee to be able to move these stands into place that take, say upwards of 150 pounds to move, which from an ergonomic standpoint just isn't safe for somebody to do on a consistent basis. So we were able to design a custom solution that utilized some of the best practices from our other caster designs to help make that stand easier to move and reduce that push force by more than half. So again, just because you have maybe an application that requires a bunch of engineering trade-offs, I think working with the right manufacturer can help mitigate some of those trade-offs and get you to a better solution that works kind of for all the constraints.
Yeah, Doug, I was going to say, I think it's important that anyone working towards designing ground support equipment reach out to their caster or wheel experts in the design phase so that they make sure that they have the right product for the application.
Yes, definitely don't wait until the last minute. We see that so many times where, unfortunately, being the caster and the wheel manufacturer, usually the designers don't think about that until the very end. And now they're already, stuck in a certain box that everything needs to fit in. And if they were working with somebody in the very beginning, they would end up with a much more cost-efficient solution in the long run that fits their application.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's pretty logical, to be looking at this design, holistically and considering all those factors. It may be a good place to kind of wrap up our conversation is to look at things a little broadly and try and summarize a few of the main challenges people in the ground support space are encountering. And again, like you suggested here, what solutions are out there to help, these people resolve any issues by utilizing the appropriate parts and components.
I would say overall in the industry, loads are getting heavier and heavier. And so therefore requirements of casters are getting more and more stringent, and not necessarily there being standard product to choose from for that for those applications. So customization is pretty critical. That you have a great engineering team behind you, especially in those custom applications.
Even beyond GSE applications, I would say just everybody is trying to do more with less. They're trying to move more weight on fewer carts and trailers. They're trying to do it all with fewer people. So now you have automation involved. Again, the ergonomics and how do you move things safely with fewer people? How do you have the right payload spec'd in when you're going to try to carry 50% more than what you were carrying last year, and keep it running longer and longer, because when it's sitting, it's not making money.
Well, thank you very much for that insight. That's going to conclude this edition of the Aviation Pros podcast. I'd like to thank our guests again. It's Doug Backinger and Alex Harden. And if you'd like to learn more about their company and their GSE components and casters, please visit www.aerol.com. That's AEROL.com. And for more information about ground support equipment and ground handling best practices, you can stay up to date by subscribing to Ground Support Worldwide's daily newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Aviation Pros podcast, please subscribe to it wherever you download your podcasts, rate and review it, and be sure to share it with your colleagues in the industry. And as always, please continue to visit AviationPros.com.